This episode is dedicated to the Lighthouse, an initiative partnered by the NSPCC. Did you know that 1 in 20 children in the UK are sexually abused, and 1/3 of those will never tell, even into adulthood? The Lighthouse is a centre in Camden in London that is a one-stop shop for sexually abused children. Historically, children have been dragged around medical practitioners, the police and social services, having to tell their story time and again and rehash their trauma. In this centre, all the services come to the child. Here they can testify on camera rather than appearing in court, and at the Lighthouse, therapy is also on hand. The Rebuilding Childhoods Board, chaired by my guest David Tate, is one of 4 boards that partners with the NSPCC, and they raise money and awareness for the Lighthouse and other projects. David's aim is for there to be 30 such centres around the UK. Currently, there is only 1. To find out more or to donate, go to www.nspcc.org.uk and look at the show notes for more details. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers and rock stars of life. My guest today is an award-winning tenor who has played pretty much every lead role across the world in every major opera theatre, from the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden to the Met in New York to La Scala in Milan. He has sung countless times at the Proms and has participated in many recordings. He brought classical music to the popular audience through the Rob and Romesh Show. He has had to learn to sing twice, once when young and a second time after thyroid cancer destroyed his voice. I'm looking forward to hearing how he managed all this, what he went through, the stepping stones to being one of the most sought-after tenors in the world, the triumphs, trauma, tragedy, the hard work and determination, and I want to hear about the joy and the fun too. Pavarotti once said, opera is the ultimate art form. It has all the elements: singing, acting, dancing, and visual spectacle. I'm really grateful and excited to be talking today to Toby Spence. Hello, Toby. Thank you so much for being
Hello, Katie.
here.
It's a great pleasure to be here. And thanks for that. That's a lovely introduction.
Well, I have to say, before we start, we have a bit of a health warning, which is that I grew up on Dartmoor, and the most cultured thing my parents and I did was listen to sort of classical music records once in a while. So forgive me if I make any ignorant
don't worry.
comments.
This happens all the time. It is very niche and it's becoming more niche. But there is a mysticism around the whole subject. And I'm here to help guide you through it if I need to. I don't think I will have to after that brilliant introduction.
Well, you grew up in a musical family. Your father was a doctor. Your mother was a pianist. And a former guest on the show, Sonia Jones, who sang with The Who and the Rolling Stones and Spandau Ballet. And she said that she grew up in a family that as early as she can remember, they were singing harmonies. So she just knew harmonies by osmosis, almost a bit like a sort of a second language. Was that your experience growing up at home?
That is something to do with it. I just knew that music was my language, my métier. It was the water that I swam in. And every time in church with the family, singing hymns, or whether there were records playing on the radio at home, whatever it was, my ears pricked up and I was engaged.
You went to Uppingham School. You very modestly said on the Talking Classical podcast that you gravitated towards music because you were rubbish at everything else.
That's totally right.
I can't believe that was right.
And I say that all the time. And all the people who know me quietly sort of go, yeah. Yeah.
How did your musical training begin?
I guess it was about mother love. I had a sister and a brother. My sister is a very gifted graphic designer. She now works in architecture and was an artist, stage designer, for a large part of her career. And my brother was extremely sporty and went to rugby, captained all the sports and all that sort of thing, and fitted very well into the model of the public school system. I went to the same prep school as him in Cambridge, one called St. Faith's, and it was not such a musical school as the other schools that you had available in Cambridge. And I felt very starved at that time of the music that I wanted to do. And I'd said to my parents that I wanted to be a chorister in one of the chapel choirs. And they said no, because it would interfere with school holidays and that would, in turn, interfere with family holidays that we might have, like skiing.
How old were you at this stage?
I was 8.
Okay.
And 8 to 13. But they put it right by sending me, instead of to the school that my brother went to, another school which was extremely strong for music. And there I had the good luck to have a teacher called Ralph Allwood, who ended up going 3 years later, after I arrived there, to Eton to be the director of music there.
I overlap with him because I taught at Eton for a little while, and he was the most passionate, inspiring musical teacher I've ever come across, really.
Some people are born to do things, and he's born to teach music. His mission in life is just to propagate music in this country, and he's done so much for it. And so when I went to Cambridge 2 nights ago, I went to Pembroke College, which doesn't have a choral foundation in its chapel, and yet there was a choir of about 40 people that were being conducted by this person, Anna Lapwood, who's a bit of a sort of media sensation in her own right. And they were there because of her, because they had been through the choral courses that Ralph had run whilst he was still at Eton. And he has germinated this extraordinary culture in that generation. In fact, my generation downwards, which has given this country so much joy, I would say. And when you listen to the music that you have at the coronation and at the funerals of the royal family, that comes about as a direct result of that tradition that people like Ralph have invested in.
That's amazing.
Yeah. It's a joy for this country. We really have a special kernel at the centre of our musical landscape that creates so much culture and so much audience, among other things, because those people may not go on to be musicians in their own right, but they've built the love.
Yes. So you came across Ralph
when I got into my
sixth
sixth form at school, I was taken to meet somebody at the Guildhall School of Music because I knew at about the age of 15 that I wanted to be a singer. I wrote to my brother and said, I think I know what I wanted to do. He was at university. I don't know if he ever got the letter. I never received a reply. I would think that he fed that back to my parents. I never got the message back saying, oh, don't do this. So I just carried on. And the school took me to meet someone called Noel Barker at the Guildhall School. And Noel Barker said, if I possibly can, go to university first, because the human voice does take time to mature. You develop both personality, which is a big part of singing, as well as technique and strength. She said, bide your time, go and be a person, have a life, have something to sing about. And so I did that. I took a year out, went to Oxford, to New College, where you were as well.
Yes.
And did the choral scholarship thing there.
Can you talk us through the sort of the interview process?
I didn't know this when I was at school, but I am dyslexic. And that held me back academically, or by not admitting it to myself, because I think I knew all the way through that my dyslexia was in question. I knew I was sort of neurodiverse, but I didn't want to be stigmatized in those days.
And none of the teachers picked it up?
No, that's right.
I mean, I guess it's a thing, when we were going through school, I didn't really hear the term dyslexia.
Yeah.
I didn't even know it was a thing.
I think dyslexia meant different things in those days, didn't it, from what it means now. It's a package with different gifts, as it were, or different possibilities. But in those days, it meant you were thick.
Yes, it did.
I did everything I can not to be packaged that way. It meant that I didn't have the tools made available to me to compensate for the difficulties that the education system posed for people like me.
Yes.
I deferred applying to Oxford until 7th term, then got my A-level results, and they were good enough for me to apply. And Edward Higginbottom was the person at New College who recognised in me something that he thought would be useful for him. He had ambition for his choir, and he saw it not just as a good instrument within the college life, but as something of value beyond the college for musical commercial reasons, as a recording body for him. So he was keen, me being a musician and a natural singer, I suppose it's not too much to say that, to have me in the choir, and so pushed hard for it. And I remember my interviews with him were moments of torture for both him and me.
Oh, why?
because the demands of the course were so much more than I was able to live up to. So there were technical aspects to do with keyboard, which was being able to harmonize in the moment. So if you have a melody, then you provide the harmony underneath. And I wasn't that kind of musician. So I remember a private interview with him doing a fairly bad job and slow, painful process for him. I remember him looking out the window into front quad and saying quietly under his breath, how am I going to get you into this college?
Oh, did you actually hear him say that?
I did.
Oh, gosh. And that is, well, I guess that on one hand, that's nice to hear. And on the other hand, it really isn't.
He got me past the selection board and then wrote me a letter saying, look, you've got a long way to go and you're going to have to do it. And got me up a term early because I took my year out. He basically got me up to speed himself.
Wow.
In a way that I could cope with the course. And then in the first year, I did a pretty bad job of staying on due course with the rest of it. But in the second year, I got myself up to speed and got passionate about the subject as well. And that has grown and grown and grown. I got through the course entirely, took a year out after that.
And looking back, did that stand you in good stead, all that work?
Yeah.
It was useful.
Certainly at the beginning, it really was. And then all of that fades away. You become a musician as you go on through the decades of it. But yes, it certainly increased my interest in the subject and made me apply myself to the letter of music, to the precision, the granular detail within what a composer writes. I found all of that a rich source of investment as well as interest.
In terms of your dyslexia, have you tackled that later on in life at all? Or?
I've never even done the test. I just know I am. And I heard someone talking on the radio, Sally Wainwright, who is a dramatist, who started off in Coronation Street. She said of her childhood that she never read books, but that she watched television a lot and was fascinated by the medium and could get it. And I sat up when I listened to this and I said, oh, that sounds familiar. And then she described how she can write, but she can't read. And I thought, that's me. I remember working on a word processor for the first time and the world coming, it was just night and day. I could see on the screen clarity in my words for the first time because it wasn't infected by my awful handwriting. There was a sort of uniformity and a lyrical aspect that I could recognize for the first time that wasn't spoilt by the sight of my words. I remember going and getting my mum and saying, look at this. Look at what I just did. And she looked at it and said, yeah, not great, actually. You know, I believed in it myself all the same.
Yeah.
And so now I love writing. It's a curious neurological thing with me. I think I learn more by communicating outwards than by drinking in information.
I can imagine. Of course, when you're growing up, you don't realize that what you're seeing isn't what everyone else is seeing. You have no benchmark. So you just accept it and you just think, oh, I'm struggling with this. And why is that person finding it easy?
It's a ghastly humiliation.
Our brilliant friend, Roger Barron, who made this possible today, he was a fellow choral scholar. You guys had a pretty rigorous timetable. So could you just take us through a typical day for you in New College?
Again, it all came down to this chap, Edward Higginbottom, who was the organist, the director of the choir in the chapel. His standards went beyond those you would expect to find in a college in Oxford or Cambridge. And he had high expectations of us to be not just good performers, but professionals. I was thinking as I walked down here, what would I say if I got to talk about Edward? Well, I'd say that he was much more, as a musician, interested in the elegance of the performance and the perfection of the performance. That is the sort of proper performance that you would expect to find in the real world of performance of classical music. That you're not so much interested in a tiny detail, but rather the overall effect and what people feel at the end, and that they're transported and they feel that this is not a performance of dots, but a performance of sound. And Edward was the supremo in that part of my life to show us how to do that and why that's more important.
And would you sing every day?
We didn't sing on Wednesdays, and we only sang one service 6 days a week. Then we sang holidays. We did tours to mostly France.
Of course you did. You went all over the place, didn't you?
Yeah, and recordings.
And Roger said to me, when you're in that world, typically a singer's ambition would be to be part of an elite choral group like the 16 or the Tallis Scholars. Said he recalled there was one particular time where you were singing brilliantly and perfectly, but not necessarily blending with everyone else. And Edward Higginbottom said, Toby, I look forward to your career.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So was that
and the subtext of that was, but not now, thanks. Yeah.
So at 15, you knew that you wanted to sing.
Yeah.
When was the moment when you thought, I actually can do this? I am going to do this.
All the way through university, I sort of knew that I was perhaps the exception. And then I went to music college and I came across singers that were much more technically advanced than me, but perhaps lacked my schooling in terms of the detail of the music and the interest in the history of it. And then I learned to sing well whilst I was at music college. I got better and caught them up and then rose to at least their level, let's say that. I started winning competitions.
That was when you were at the Guildhall?
Yeah, patterning that, I learnt that whatever I applied myself in this métier, I would sort of rise to the surface of it. It was not so much one thing. It was just a pattern. I knew that a path of least resistance, wherever I went with it, doors opened. And compared to other people I knew who were trying the same things, I was going at a faster pace than them. And I got the feeling that as a package, I was a better proposition for agencies fairly early on, and that all of them came to me and said, well, would I be interested? And then I went with the agency that I felt I could trust, and they weren't trying to sort of flatter me and tell me they could open the world up for me. They were saying only I could do that, but they could support me in that. And I thought, that's what I want to hear. All the way through that was good. And then when I was still at college, the doors kept opening, and then the word gets around that there's this one or two exceptional people coming through. And then you see in people's faces that they know who you are before you know who they are.
Oh my gosh, that must be make you really hopeful, proud, excited.
It does. It was a wonderful time, I have to say that. And it felt boundless. And yes, I was floating like a balloon every day. I got all my dream jobs even before I'd left college. And I had 2-3 years of beautiful work lined up, including a concert with Pavarotti.
Oh, wow.
I know. Yeah.
In 1995, you were snapped up. And was that before you left the Guildhall or just after the Guildhall?
So I snapped up before I left the Guildhall.
Okay.
I had an agency in 94 and they had already lined up for me. And I left the Guildhall early because I was already busy.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Was this your first major role, Idamante
and Idomeneo. Again, my agency, who are very big, very powerful, knew everybody in the business and had very good relationships on their sort of trustworthiness. And so when they put someone forward, people thought, this is probably a good idea. This person's probably able to do this role. And so even though I was a student, I was trialed out for the role. I got to sing to the conductor, a chap called Charles McCarris, who's Australian. And everybody thought this was good, but because I was inexperienced, that I would have extra coaching. So much the same as when I got into Oxford, and that I would be brought up to speed.
And are you nervous when you're going along for these things, or are you feeling confident enough and buoyant enough?
My confidence was strong by this stage. And it was such a regular thing to be going into auditions that I guess it was just the rhythm of life. And I would go from one to the next, and I'd do this and set out. I analysed what auditions were about and what they were from the point of view of the people on panels for auditions, and realised that how repetitive they could be, and that if I did repertoire or songs that they heard 3-4 times a day, I was undermining my ability to get past their reckoning. What I had to do was produce things that they hadn't heard that day and new repertoire that would be interesting for them.
Yeah, that's clever.
And then we could have a sort of dialogue and talk about it. And there are other aspects of it. But I analysed the audition process and managed to steer myself into a position where I felt confident doing them. It's still the case that new talent has an exciting period at the beginning of their careers. There are a few reasons for that, because they're fresh-faced, they're perhaps naive as well. That means that they're pliant, easy to accommodate within the old structures, because they bring a breath of fresh air. Also because they're cheap.
Right.
There is a fee structure and it doesn't go downwards as you get older. It's the economies of the arts as they are. It fits very well with that. So if you can find someone who will do a role when they're 25 rather than 35, it's going to be beneficial.
Well, there are so many different strands to your career. I've been listening on Spotify and I was trying to think, how do I describe Toby's voice? beautiful and powerful and passionate. And yet it also sounds a bit like you're just breathing. It also feels like just really effortless as well.
Oh, thank you.
But out of all those roles that you've done, could you pick a standout one that made you think, I can't believe I'm here?
It's very easy for me to answer that because I'm English and I'm a tenor. And there's this composer, Benjamin Britten, who wrote for his life partner, Peter Pears, and he wrote the greater part of his canon with his voice in mind. My voice isn't like his, but he left this body of work behind that is both poetic, dramatic, lyrical, exquisitely interesting. Because of Benjamin Britten, my life as a performer has been twice what it would have been without it. And his music has made my life so interesting and has taken me to places that I would never have been able to go. That is the clear answer. And of the roles that I've done of his, I've done all of them except for one, which is Peter Grimes, which I now, at the age of 55, I don't think I'll ever do. But Death in Venice is an opera that he wrote in the 70s. I think that's probably the most interesting and demanding dramatically role that I've done.
Where does your sort of joy come from?
The real indicator is when you walk into the first rehearsal, the rehearsal in the middle of the process, the last rehearsal, the first performance and the last performance, and you're longing to get in there and do it. For all of those, you're thinking about it, you're reaching for new ideas, and it stays with you, and the music becomes hypnotic and at the same time addictive. And for the parcel of that moment, you're just a sort of an instrument of his music.
And can you be transported in those moments?
That's very real for us when time disappears and place disappears. But it's not every time. You hope for that moment and you know what it feels like. I think conductors feel it because they are mute and it's a physical thing. Their mind is so occupied with the moment and communicating and listening and responding. I think they get it quite often. I am grounded in the physicality of it and remembering to measure certain things. And I have to keep a certain amount of my application, cognizance, awareness on the technical and the difficult aspects of it. Always just a certain amount of that. But sometimes you let go and it's a wonderful feeling.
You're learning lines, you're learning different language. You're then having to hit the notes as well, and you're acting. You are doing so many things in one moment.
There are many parts to the machine. Even just within myself, I guess there are various disciplines which I'm trying to synthesize into one thing, one act. The French word for rehearsal is répétition, or repetition. I think it's an essential part of getting to a level that it looks organic to the audience and feels organic for us, but it does take repeat to get there. The preparation process is a slow and very involved and sometimes difficult climb. It's daunting when you open that first page and you think, how will I ever get on top of this music? But you do. Experience tells you that if you just work and start, what is a completely unknown country becomes familiar slowly. And once you get a foothold in it, it grows and grows, and then it gets inside you and you put it away and you start to remember it and test yourself for it. It takes root again and you're off on that journey with it.
With all this incredible success that you have had, there must come some fame with it. Roger told me this great story. It was your debut at the Met. And the night before, Roger said you didn't drink anything and you didn't say anything.
Yeah, we went to an NBA game. We went to the Mets. It was over on the other side of the Hudson River, but now it's in Brooklyn. Jay-Z owns it, but not then. We went to an NBA game and I was very good and went to bed early. I did my matinee performance the next day and then we went to a hotel close to the Met, the Mandarin Oriental.
First time at the Met. That must have been an extraordinary experience.
It really was. It was a beautiful experience and it went very well for me. I fitted in with the family of the Opera House, which was obviously very important for the Met because it's a huge machine. We went out to celebrate and we started off with cocktails at the Mandarin. And then the concierge recognized me because he happens to be an opera fan. He basically put the resources of the Mandarin, such as they were for us, at our disposal for the evening, which included a Bentley to take us downtown.
That's so great.
It was great. And we got in this thing, having finished our cocktail. he was so amenable for us. And the driver said, where do you want to go? We want to go to the Lower East Side. We said, we're going to go to a club. As we were going down Broadway, we said, do you ever open this thing up? Did Roger tell you this bit?
No, he did not.
And he said, no, but let's do it. And floored the car.
Whoa.
And took us what felt like Star Wars speed down to the Lower East Side. That was that. And then we had Sting's table at a club.
Brilliant.
Terrible.
Well, maybe the next day.
Yeah,
Terrible.
disastrous.
Has that changed your life, being as well known?
It really hasn't, because it is a niche art form, and occasionally you get a lovely window of recognition like that and you sort of capitalize on it, and it's fun and it looks fun, but it's not the reality of my day-to-day life.
Well, that's actually probably a blessing. Tara Fitzgerald, I don't know if you remember her, but she was a wonderful actor, very beautiful person. She was a guest on the show, and she was in a different area, but similarly to you, the lead in everything for a while in her 20s. And then at the age of 30, that all changed, because suddenly the next 20-year-old was taking that position and she had to reinvent herself. But for a while, it was a shock and it felt quite brutal. And I wondered, given that you were the lead in pretty much everything and your voice changes as you get older, did you ever experience that?
The truth is that all the way through my career, there have been peaks and troughs, relatively small ones. But as I get older, I'm aware of the troughs being deeper and the peaks being lower. That's just a natural process, and I think everybody experiences that. And I think that's as much to do with expectation as anything else. If you've been used to 30 years of it, like I am, you learn to go with it, but you also learn to be honest and realistic about it. It's awful to hear about people who have an extraordinary career in their 20s and then to be basically dropped. That wasn't my experience. We all know that it happens much more for females than males. That's a tragedy in its own observation. For me, the problem started in the end of 2011 when I was diagnosed with cancer. Then I had this very fallow period of 9 months thereabouts when I couldn't sing because I had an operation and it was in my throat. I'd had thyroid cancer and had my thyroid removed and a lot of other stuff around that area, which affected the way I sang because it affected the nerve connection with my larynx.
Did you know that was going to happen when you had this surgery?
They told me and I didn't believe it. I just thought, oh, I've always found it very easy when I have a sore throat to get my voice back. But no, this was a shock when I came out of surgery and I realized it was much worse than I thought it was going to be. I went into this fallow period of 8 months, in fact. I knew that I had to work very hard to get back to where I needed to be. It was only after the fact that I spoke to my teacher with whom I've been studying since I was 18, the same guy called David Pollard, who lives here in London. I was staying with Roger, whom you know. Roger and Claire put me up and to sort of convalesce with them. On about the second night after I went to them, I said, I still haven't told David about this. And they said, well, you must. It's time to do that. And encouraged me to go and pick up the phone and speak to David. And I said, this is what's happened. And he was very calm. And he just said, Toby, you're going to get yourself back to a position of strength. And then you're going to come to me for lessons. And you're not going to pay me for lessons until you get back on stage. And you're going to come to me every day. We're going to do whatever it takes. And I did. And he got me back, not really in the state I should have been when I first started performing. But as he said, I had to sing on stage to find the rest of it. And so I did. And it was a desperate and painful process. And I remember going onto the stage at the Proms for a televised performance and not knowing what was going to come out of my voice. I thought it could go disastrously wrong live on television. Luckily, it didn't. And I kept going. And I said to myself, as long as things seem to get better, I'm going to keep the faith and keep going. And they tended to get better and improve for about 6 years. And then I thought, okay, well, I can go with this. I can keep going with this as it is. It never quite got back to how easy it had been before.
So was it the quality of your voice?
There's a sense in singing when you're doing it well that you're flying. I felt, I think, all the time that I was not so much gliding when I was flying as flapping my wings in order to fly. I still had the great feeling, and I was very lucky to be there and very happy to be there and enjoyed singing. But it was never the effortless thing that I had before.
Did you tell people in the opera world that this had happened to you? Because people will be very sympathetic and they'll put a line through your name as well.
So when it happened, I really was at the peak of my career, and doors were opening that I could never have expected would open. And I had to cancel some very prominent work, and it seemed fair to talk openly about it. So I opened up to the Times and did an interview about it with them, and they published it. So it was out then. That was a relief, but it was also tough. Because I hoped that I could sort of go back into the working life without anybody knowing, and nobody would hear things that weren't necessarily there. But the cat was out of the bag.
I would imagine you must have had many moments of, is this going to work? Is it worth it?
Yeah, and what else can I do? The answer to that question never came. And so I just carried on and sort of committed to that, and I may as well. And the thing about what I do as a singer is that I'm booked up 3 or 4 years in advance. So the contracts were out there. I just had to turn up and fulfill them and hope I wasn't fired, which I never was. But I knew that I wasn't sort of living up to the expectation that I would have had before the reality of the surgery. It was a curious and difficult period where I was glad to be alive, of course, and working at a high level, but so sad to not be fulfilling the expectations.
But now, does it feel that you are?
Yeah, I mean,
it sounds as if
I
you
think
are.
I definitely, because I'm 55 now, the type of work that I do, those demands of the sort of fresh-faced, pure-voiced singer aren't the same now, and I'm allowed to be older. I'm delighted to be turning up to jobs and singing and doing the best I can.
Well, in May 2012, so your surgery was only in February, you received the award for Singer of the Year from the Royal Philharmonic Society. And it was only August when you first sang in public, which is quite extraordinary.
So when I received that award, I had a neuropraxia around the right side of my mouth. And I made a speech.
What does that
so
mean,
that
Toby?
means that you have numbness.
Okay.
And sometimes my bottom lip could sort of curl forwards. And I was aware that halfway through my acceptance of this award, my lip was curling forwards. And that meant that I would dribble.
Oh, Toby.
So I had to wrap up the whole thing as quickly as I could and go and grab a napkin. It was awful. And there I was saying that I was looking forward to getting back on stage. And I knew that my speaking voice was weak as a mouse. The whole thing felt very empty and very, very wrong.
Having gone through all of that, was there any advice you could give for people who are facing something similar?
Be patient. Believe it will come back. But take time and don't get out there too soon. And don't put too much pressure on yourself to perform at the same level as you were beforehand. You will get there, but it takes time. So maybe just take it slower.
Okay. Classics has been pulled from the curriculum. I have a friend of mine, Jeffrey Diaga, and a former guest, Jimmy Mulville, who are great supporters of this charity, Classics for All, to try and now put classics back into state schools. It feels like music is heading in a similar direction. It seems to be being given ever decreasing importance. If you had a couple of minutes with the Minister for Education, what would you say to them?
What I would like to see established is a link between the DCMS and education departments, that they're talking to each other. I don't know if you meditate.
I try.
This is it.
Unsuccessfully, but I try.
So tell me about your experience of the times when you do it, and let's say you do 4 days in a row, and then you lapse. You know the benefits, and you know that there's everything to be said for finding that little bit of time, 10 minutes, 15 minutes,
Absolutely.
whatever it is.
Absolutely.
And the whole of the rest of your life benefits from that. And yet it's so easy to lapse. and just say, I'll pick it up another time. And then 4 days lapse and you feel like you've got out of the benefits. You're beyond the benefits of it. That is what music education does for children in schools. The benefits just go everywhere. You can't put your finger, it's unquantifiable, but it's to do with correlation between contemporaries, between your peer group. It's about cooperation. It's about learning a skill. It's about getting beauty in your life. Also, music can be viewed as another language. So you're developing another way of expressing yourself. You also, within music, find out who you are because you find your music, your voice. I would just like them to hear that and know that with all my heart, and I know that they would experience the same thing with meditation if they do it, Lisa Nandy or whoever, the education minister, and that if they thought about it, they would know that the commitment of space and time in schools would be so good on so many levels. And that every department that government sees would see within 5 years a huge upturn in every way.
Musicians do seem to be getting smacked in all sorts of areas because there's been a downturn in funding for the arts in general. Musicians were not treated well during COVID. Because of Brexit, it's harder for musicians to be performing abroad. On the inside track, as you are, how has that affected you?
Hugely in terms of the work that I do in Europe, because I was speaking to somebody who comes from Barcelona who works at the opera house there called the Liceu. She said, look, if we have 2 people to be cast for one role and one of them has paperwork and one of them doesn't, we're going to go for the one that doesn't have paperwork. That's the nature of administration. They don't have time. So that has affected every musician in the UK. The first tranche of difficulties that we had in the music industry in this country came as a result of the collapsing of the recording industry. When the recording industry no longer became a money-making entity.
Is that because of Spotify and all the streaming platforms?
That's right, because people consume music differently. We have about 9 orchestras in London. The reason we have 5 of them as full-time, mostly freelance, but constantly working orchestras is because they were quick to learn and cheap to record. They took the full fee for the recording, but because they were quick to learn and they were disciplined, the product was always good and relatively cheap. And so we built a huge industry around this in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And then the money started to seep away because the repertoire had been recorded. And people didn't want a 5th recording of Beethoven's 9th Symphony. The economies started to shrank. We still had the most powerful agencies. We still have the hardware of the orchestras, but they had to adapt in order to make ends meet. And that's why you get the London Philharmonic Orchestra working as the house orchestra for Glyndebourne, and the Philharmonia Orchestra working as the house orchestra for the other country house opera called Garsington, and so forth. It's adaptation. But that's what they have to do to make ends meet. But we still have these 9 orchestras, and we don't really have the audience or the demand for tickets to justify those orchestras as just performing concerts. So we have to find other reasons for them to be, which include tours, some recordings, commercial work, film, but also game music is a big part of their revenue stream. That was the first tranche of difficulties that we came across in the burgeoning music industry in this country. And then COVID came along and freelancers were clobbered. And then the shape of the industry inverted. The light bulb became a pear. And you had all of these students suddenly not able to go into work because there weren't places in the performance industry for them because it shrunk. The repertoire has shrunk, the amount of performances have shrunk. Everything's just been cut at certain corners. And so there's now roughly, in the opera world, half as much work as there was in the UK in terms of performances.
Pre-COVID?
Yeah. So if you look at it in terms of the numbers, in terms of size of the operas they do, slightly smaller. Size of the choruses they use, slightly smaller. Size of the orchestras, slightly smaller. And then it's number of performances, slightly smaller. Shorter rehearsal periods. Because of those little snips here and there, we're now reduced to about half as much opera. And then Brexit comes along, and we're no longer, unless it's special projects specific to the English canon, they're not interested in us so much now because there are cheaper and simpler alternatives to be employed from Europe. And what I was saying about the light bulb and the pear, there used to be more jobs, and we used to bring people in from outside the country in order to fill those jobs, but we don't do that anymore. So there's been another influence on the shrinking of the whole thing. And then it's been defunded. Inflation has gone up, but pay hasn't. Living costs in London continue to go up. But again, there's no support for that. More than 50% of the music industry is based here in London rather than outside it. And there's an exodus from London. The bodies who are charged with supporting it are not supporting it. So if anything, Arts Council England are defunding it. There is this perception that the art form is elitist. And so it's very easy then for comedians to get on Radio 4 and use opera and classical music as the whipping boy for their own particular stand of virtue signalling. I did a concert on Friday night with a young orchestra called the Fantasia Orchestra, who were great. And they were so enthusiastic, and they were such lovely people. And they came forwards about the jump off between music college, where they felt so positive and felt so supported and felt so able to express themselves as musicians, compared to the reality of getting out there and having to make a living, where they're expected to give so much in return for so little that it makes it unsustainable for them. I'm looking to create a roundtable discussion for different types of freelancers from the creative industries, where we can create a questionnaire that will apply to all aspects of it, to do with living standards, and do they feel like their compensation has kept step with inflation and living standards, and practical questions. And we're dividing it into age group, sector, gender. And from that, I hope we will get enough data to be able to come back to DCMS and to education and say, look, this is the reality of where we are, and to show to Arts Council England the cost of funding in some areas and then funding downwards in other areas. We'll see where that goes.
Moving on to your blog, because I've really enjoyed reading it. So enjoyed reading it. Given there's the great showbiz thing, the show must go on. I would love you to tell the Geneva story when the show almost didn't go on.
Yeah. So I think it was 2008 when there was the fog that descended on the Thames Valley and closed all the airports. I was doing a production in Geneva of a piece called Meistersinger von Nuremberg by Wagner, which is a 6-hour opera. And I had skipped back in between performances to London, because it was quite close to Christmas, to just be at home and see friends and catch up.
How much time did you have in between this particular performance?
3 days. So It would have been 2 nights. And then going back on the morning of the next performance. And there I was at City Airport looking at the board. And suddenly I noticed that the flights were slowly being cancelled. But mine was still out. There was a Swiss Air flight that was hovering above City Airport and was due to come in. And then at about 8:30 in the morning, the sign came up, the flight has been cancelled. It's been diverted to another airport. I thought, what am I going to do? I rang my agent and I said, I've made a big mistake. I have to be in Geneva this evening. Did
they know you'd come to the UK?
No. Geneva didn't know, and neither did my agent. And they said, okay, get going towards the centre of town. We're going to look at your contract. We're going to see what we can do, maybe dig you out of this. So I got going on the DLR towards Bank. I rang my partner. She got in the car to come and pick me up. And by the time I got there, my agent was on the phone and they were saying to me, we've looked at the contract, and if you don't get back to Geneva, then you are responsible for the compensation of the audience. You have to refund their tickets, you refund the orchestra, you refund all the soloists. And it is about the largest opera in the canon. So there were about 20 soloists, and then there was a huge chorus. And then I had to repay the bars and the restaurants in the opera house for lost revenue.
That is stress.
It was going to cost me, I think, 500,000 Swiss francs, or the equivalent of 500,000 in Swiss francs. So I said, okay, what's the alternative? And they said, well, we've organised it already. You're going to go to Oxford Airport. I didn't know it existed, and get a plane. And as I was driving along, I said to my partner, well, at least I'm going to be able to say that I've been on a private jet for work. You know, doesn't that look great? Look at the positives.
I know, that's really positive given your 500,000 Swiss franc cloud over your head.
So I arrive at the airport, put my credit card down. It was extremely expensive for this flight, and then went out onto what I thought was going to be tarmac, but was in fact grass. And I thought, oh, hello. And it was just a small Cessna sort of Uber cab with wings. And it was freezing in the back of this thing. The pilot gave me a bag with 2 sandwiches in and some bottles of water. We flew over Paris and had a beautiful view. I got to Geneva just in time, got to the theatre with half an hour before the curtain went up.
That's close.
In that half hour, I spent the whole time in makeup being given a dressing down by the boss of the opera house. So I went onto the stage with my tail between my legs and feeling quite shaken by the whole experience.
Yes.
But it went really well.
So the show did go on.
It really did go on. And I came away feeling pretty good about the whole thing and having dodged a bullet, a big bullet.
Yeah, definitely. Such a good story. Rapid fire questions. You taught Romesh to sing Nissim Dorma.
Yes.
I didn't actually hear how he did it in the end because I tried to find it on the internet and I couldn't find it. Can anyone learn to sing?
So he's a total dude, that guy.
Is he?
He's a hard worker and his instincts in every area are just fantastic. He took me really seriously and he listened, and all the lessons that I gave him, he took on board. The main lesson was that when you get out in front of an audience, you forget everything and you go back to all the mistakes he said you'd never do. And so he did. But he had 2 goes at singing Nessun Dorma, which is an extremely difficult thing to do. And he pulled it off. He adapted, he changed what said he was going to do, and he brought the house down. So good for him.
Yeah, good for him.
Is it possible to teach anybody to sing? I can make anybody a better singer. I can't necessarily make them a great singer.
Fair enough. Most embarrassing moment on stage?
Oh, now there's that story of when I was naked on stage at Edinburgh International Festival. I was playing a man dressed as a woman within the context of the story.
The Mad Woman of
Curly River by Benjamin Britten. And the group of instrumentalists were behind me on the set. And in this very tender, quiet moment where I have a duet with a flute behind me, in the staging, I was to go to the very front of the stage and lift up my dress under which I had no underwear in my sort of anxiety and my grief-stricken moment, singing extremely pained and glorious and tender music. And it's a very revealing in every way moment, at which point the chap on the front row right by my feet in a rugby shirt said in a broad Glaswegian accent, "Oh, no, not again." And it was everything I could do not to corpse.
Of course.
Yeah.
You had to just keep going.
Yeah.
And you did.
Just about, a few cracks here and there.
Oh, gosh, good for you. Worst audition?
There was a great vignette of my life was coming out when my first year as a singer. I had to get to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam to do an audition. I came off stage in Southampton of a tour, the first tour I'd ever done with Welsh National Opera, the piece that you mentioned earlier on, Idomeneo. And it was the night that Rosemary West was convicted. And it was pouring with rain, and I had just missed the last train back to London because the show had gone up late. And I hitchhiked back to London in the rain. And I've still got in the back of my score of Idomeneo a sign that written in biro, scribbled biro, "London, please." And I eventually got back to London at about 4:00 in the morning, enough time to have 40 minutes sleep before going to the airport to go to Amsterdam for this audition. And I arrived at what I thought was the audition, knocked on the door, and the people inside the place where I was having the audition said, "You've come on the wrong day. You're meant to be here on Monday. This is Friday." So that was a pretty bad start. I went back to London for the weekend, developed a cold, and then went back to the Amsterdam on the Monday, bunged up with a cold and screeched my way through the audition and didn't get the job.
No. You wrote about that on your blog.
Yeah.
I was hoping you were going to tell that one.
Yeah.
Most important daily habit?
Listening to podcasts.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a great way to educate myself and switch off at the same time. The rest is history. I cannot get enough of those two. I think they're amazing.
Yeah, they are amazing. They're absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like you ever get nervous.
For me as a performer was to acknowledge that I get nervous and then I could deal with it.
How do you deal with it? For the rest of us who get very nervous.
I tell myself before I go onto the stage, standing in the wings, that something is going to go wrong.
Really?
Yeah. And then it's okay.
That's so clever.
Then you're ready to field it when it does. Whereas if you say to yourself, it must not go wrong, it must not go wrong, because of the NLP principles of positive messaging, what you're really hearing is, it must go wrong. It's inevitable that it will. Whereas if you say to yourself, it's fine when it does, and it will, it's all fine.
Music is so powerful. It can change your mood. It can make you happy. It can make you sad. It can take you back to a place in time. I remember sharing a double set with Helen Sherborne. I was below Roger. We bought 2 CDs, Tracy Chapman, Fast Car, and In Excess. Need You Tonight was the single.
Good choices.
Yeah. And I think we probably drove Roger mad because that's all we played for a year because we only bought 2. Can you think of a piece of music that takes you back to New College?
It would be Back to Life, Back to Reality, Soul to Soul.
Yes.
Do you remember that summer?
Yes, I do.
And that was
remember
89.
that song.
Yeah.
And there were that college bops, as they were called then. Yeah, that was played.
It was everywhere.
All the time.
Yeah.
And Toby, around that time, I think I'm right in saying that your mother passed away.
Yeah.
And I was with a friend of mine, lovely friend of mine, Mel Campion, this weekend, and she was talking about when her father died she was a bit younger than you, how that has affected her life. And I just wondered if you felt okay to talk about how you coped.
It happened just before my finals and I put it away. I said, Mum would want me to focus on finals. And I said, I'll deal with it after those. That was the right decision. It was the only decision I could make at the time. And I took a year out after university to just try and come to terms with things and take things slowly before launching into the rest of my life. That was a good decision. But the reality is that everybody has a reckoning with that one, and you come back, you revisit it, often in therapy later in life. And I think it takes time for it to go through its cycle and to take you to a place where you know that you have to stop and address it. I don't want to land my mother's death with the explanation for the ending of my marriage in my 20s. That was my doing. But I think it was partly in reaction to the trauma of losing a parent in a tender part of your life. Mum's with me every day. We were very close. And one of the things we shared was music. And so every time I'm doing music, of course, it's in reference to our relationship together. The little bit of me singing or playing piano with her. It was incredibly formative. My relationship with Mum, as I said before, was really built on me not being a sports person like my brother and not being an artist like my sister, but being a musician. And we always shared that. And I had this key with her through music to be able to unlock our close friendship. That will always be with me. We carry people around with us all the time. We are who we are, partly because of who people make us.
Yes.
I don't have regrets over that. And I do see the positives in losing Mum at that time as well, in that it meant that I could carry her with me through my life as a musician. Rather than have her outside me, I could have her inside me. That's been very special.
What's happening next? Because
apart from this roundtable thing, which is very much on my radar at the moment, I'm off to Hamburg week after next to go to concerts of Schoenberg and Bruckner, so Austrian composers. And then I've got a concert here in London of Benjamin Britten again. But the next big projects are going to be in the new year. I'm going off to Wagner Opera in Dublin, and then looks like to Aix-en-Provence in France for the summer.
Wow. Okay. Well, will you please keep me posted as to what you're doing? Because I really want to come and see it, and also we'll post about it as well to let listeners know where you're going to be. And
lovely. Great. Thank you.
And I will also put your brilliant blog. I'll
Please
make
do.
it easy for people to click on the link so that they can take a look as well. I had such a lovely time reading it, and I learned a lot, and you made me laugh out loud.
You said, what's the thing that I do daily? And it's not quite daily that I do it, but actually writing with these 13 plus years of experience, now to be writing about it is the most joyous thing I do. It really is. And there's so much. I realize every time I write one thing, I see that there are 5 more things that I can write about.
Yeah.
And it's sort of fractalizing into, perhaps the most positive thing in my life right now.
Autobiography next. Because we've just scratched the surface here, but you've been so generous with your time, Toby, and I've had such a lovely time talking to you. So thank you so much.
Katie, it's been great. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B, Head of Marketing, to all of the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.